I'm a big horror movie buff, and I like to check out a lot of the indie horror films because I actually think those are usually the best ones. And one movie that's been getting a lot of kind of underground buzz or indie filmmaker buzz is a movie called Pontypool. Very silly name that I'm sure was tailor-made to just be remarkable in that, you're like, Pontypool, what's that? It sounds goofy. But I really want to avoid spoilers for this one because this one kind of relies on you coming into it fresh. And I think the spoilers are unavoidable because they do kind of... I'll tell you what the box says, and I'll tell you why it's wrong. I think this one calls it... Let me see. This one calls it Cronenbergian. I would disagree. I don't think they know what Cronenberg really means. If you watch The Fly or you watch Videodrome, I don't think you would call this Cronenbergian. Where is it? Oh, yeah. They call it a grade A, one-of-a-kind zombie film. This is not a zombie movie. In fact, not at all. This one is actually very original. But how to describe this movie? First of all, I would not really call this a movie. I'll give you the setup, which is not spoiling anything. It's about a radio host who is giving his morning kind of shock jock radio thing when all of a sudden weird things start happening. Like he gets a bunch of callers who are speaking very unusually, describing a strange event, like a riot or something like that. The traffic guy calls in and he sees this weird stuff happening over the city, and things start to snowball. Really dire, tragic, devastating things start to happen, and it all pretty much happens inside his radio booth. So you're not really seeing anything because the camera almost never leaves the main character's face because he's sitting in a booth doing the show. And that's kind of the point, is you see no more than what this guy does while doing his show, hearing these accounts from other people who are actually at the event. And so my initial thought was, this is really good, and it's not a movie. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, this is a radio drama. Pure and simple radio theater. This is almost exactly like the radio show of War of the Worlds. And in fact, I think if you were ever going to put a tagline on this one, I would not call it grade A, one-of-a-kind zombie film. I would call it like a spiritual successor to H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds radio show. Now, why did they make it a movie? Well, because nobody listens to radio dramas anymore, and you can't put that on a blockbuster shelf. Now, that being said, I thought this was a very well-shot movie, and they did a lot with a very confined, very uninteresting set. A radio booth is not really that interesting of a place. They don't really do anything with it, but they do a lot of camera moves. They do a lot of tricks with it. They keep the camera moving fairly dynamically. And that's actually a fairly big challenge when you're making a show that is almost entirely exposition and talk, to make that a very kinetic, make that an interesting viewing experience. And I think they did that. On the other hand, I could have watched basically this entire movie with my eyes closed and gotten the exact same experience. Now, I still very much enjoyed this movie, but I think I was actually, what the funny thing is? I am a big listener of radio dramas. Now, I haven't listened to that many recently, but, back when I was a kid, and even in teenage and my college years, I was listening to a ton of radio theater. The Sci-Fi Channel actually had like a dedicated branch devoted to radio theater called Seeing Your Theater. Listened to it all the time. I listened to the H.G. Wells thing. I remember that Leonard Nimoy had a very, I forget what he called it, but he had a very long-running radio theater thing where they actually did Journey to the Center of the Earth, War of the Worlds, things like that. And I listened to the radio shows of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Basically, I would check these books out from I would check these radio shows out from the library, listen to them on cassette tape. And so, if Pontypool interests you, if you watch this and go, this was a really good movie, you are enjoying radio theater. You should try to find more shows like radio theater because it is very interesting. And I hope if if this does anything for you, is that it introduces the concept of radio theater to you, and you very much enjoy it. Because that's what this is. Now, there are some things that might have been a little difficult to do on the radio, but that's not... I mean, there comes a point when the characters are trying to be quiet, and they're writing things down on a piece of paper. But they could be whispering, they could be doing something like... you could even go so far as to have, like, internal monologue and having that be, audible, something like that. I don't know. But the other reason I really like this one is because it deals with a lot of concepts, and it's very much like one of my favorite novels of all time called Snow Crash. And it's very similar in that way because it deals with a lot of things like what... It's not going to make much sense to you unless you've read the book, but like things like deep structures, deep programming, natural language, the comprehension, the way the brain processes language, and basic concepts. If you've ever read books like How We Decide, things like that, very interesting stuff. Now, this book doesn't. I mean, this movie doesn't go that far into it, but it's radio drama. Very much liked it. I would check it out. Now, I think the ending does get a little too far-fetched. Again, hard to describe, but I might have written it a little differently. Well, anyway, I hope that's actually raised some interest in you, or at the very least, if you're not into the whole radio horror thing, I would like to point out the radio version of The Lord of the Rings was actually, for a long time, kind of the definitive version of The Lord of the Rings before the movies came out. And so that was really how I first experienced the books. I really did not read the books until after I heard the radio show. I know, it's kind of weird to think that, but I heard the radio show first, and it's very, very well done. And what's funny is, the radio show, I think, is like 22 cassette tapes. I actually have the cassette tapes somewhere around here. I have them on CD now, but yeah. What's funny is, it's basically like unedited. It's the entire series, like beginning to end. Like, how you might have argued that you may not have liked how the movies cut out too much, or it cut out various elements, or it maybe compressed things a little too much. It changed things you didn't like. Well, the radio show is basically that whole thing, beginning to end, uncut. But they do make one major cut. Even in the radio show, it didn't make the cut for the radio show, and that included everything. You know what that was? Tom Bombadil. Not in the radio show. He is not there, man. Nothing. So I always love to bring that up, where like people who... I actually got in arguments. I know some friends who argue that Tom Bombadil fucking essential to that movie, or fucking essential to the story. But even the radio show was like, this is just weird. We do not need this. Anyway, Pontypool. Not as... I don't know if it sounds dirty, but it's not as dirty as it sounds. But I would check it out. And, you don't even need the TV on. Just, like, you can... Well, I guess you do to hear the sound, but you don't even need to be looking at it. Just be looking at something else, and you'll get the same experience. But, yeah, I'd check it out. Pretty good.